I listened to a previous panel, and the discussion in part was about the shadow. And so I just wanted to share a quote by Carl Jung that's been very inspirational to me. And what he said is that the best political, social, and spiritual work that we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. The other thing that he said was in 1959, several years before he died, it was a face-to-face interview. It was incredible, and it was so inspiring. Took a transcript, made a transcript about part of it. But one of the things he said was sort of a invitation for psychedelic research, and it was that we need to study psychology. We need to understand how the human mind works. We know so little of man. We need to understand more because we are the source of all coming evil. And now this was someone who had seen what happened in World War II, was concerned about things, and the natural disasters are not evil, but we are the source of all coming evil. So I think there's just this need to go deep into ourselves, into the shadow parts of ourselves, and work through that. And so I'll talk just mostly about the MDMA research, and I also want to do a slight shift here so that whenever you have questions, if anybody has questions, just raise your hand, and somebody will come by with a microphone. So you don't have to wait till the end. So I'd rather that if you do have questions, just ask them, and we can kind of because you might have a question that other people have as well, and rather than keep it in your mind, it'd be better if you just ask it, and we'll have that discussion. The other thing I just want to share before I start my talk is something that's astonishing to me in terms of how well this mainstreaming is going in certain aspects. And so I just exchanged emails several days ago with the U.S. ambassador to Poland. And he reached out to me. And what he is interested in doing is having a briefing on MDMA-assisted therapy for potential use in Poland with Ukrainian refugees with PTSD. And well, and he sent me this email on his State Department email. This is an official communication from the State Department that they're interested in learning. Now, I don't know that he's representative of the entire State Department, but it was just really astonishing for me to receive this email and to think that this is something that might actually happen. And this is what we're trying to do. We were about to train a group of Ukrainian therapists in MDMA-assisted therapy before the war. And once the war started, we've been unable to do that. And now we're trying to figure out a training outside of the area of Ukraine where we can actually do this training. And so we're hoping to do that in the next couple months. Ukrainians, just to say, are stuck with some terrible laws from Russia so that they cannot do research with Schedule I drugs until it gets rescheduled. So how we bring it into Ukraine or Armenia, other places that have these laws, we have to have a lot of political policy shifts first. But there's a conference in Ukraine that's happening next week that's with the military psychiatrists at the largest military hospital, and it's been approved by the Minister of Health. And so they may be willing to make some changes in their laws as well because they have such a terrible situation with PTSD. So that's just kind of background. So what I want to talk about now, April 8th, 1986 is when I started MAPS. So we just hit our 37th anniversary. We're planning a party for the 38th anniversary. And as it turns out, the universe has decided to celebrate as well. So April 8th, 2024 is a full solar eclipse through much of the United States. And the next one won't be till 2044. So we're trying to think of where we might hold this kind of gathering to celebrate the eclipse and the 38th anniversary of MAPS. And it should be right around the time, close to the time we hope that we'll get FDA approval as well. So there may be a lot to celebrate. This image is Alex Gray's interpretation of the MAPS logo. And why it's so important and why I'm sharing it with you now is that the imagery tells the story, which is that the hands are in front of the psychedelic swirls in the back. And what this means is that we're really about therapy. This is a therapeutic intervention. The psychedelics help the therapy be more effective. It's humans helping humans, with the psychedelics being a tool, but I think we want to get away from thinking about the psychedelics as the tool in and of itself. Now, of course, I do believe that we have a parallel track of what we're trying to do. The first track is drug development, making this into a medicine covered by insurance with licensed therapists who've been well trained, ideally cross trained in ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, other things, 5-MeO as it comes along. But that this sense is that the second track is legalization. And so we need to move to a post-prohibition world. And so people will have access, we hope, to psychedelics without having to be in a therapeutic situation, without having to have a clinical diagnosis, without having to have a religious ceremonial context. But what we need for that, to make that work out, is, pure drugs, honest drug education, training the public in peer support, and psychedelic harm reduction. And so I'm anticipating that around 10 years or so after we get medical MDMA and medical psilocybin-assisted therapies for both of those, the culture will be ready to move towards legalization. So I don't mean to say that psychedelics should only be taken in a therapeutic situation, but what we're talking about is moving through the culture in that way, and also working with people that are seriously struggling with PTSD and other illnesses. So in those circumstances, I do think that it's really important. However, one of our staff just did a presentation about how during the 1980s, he's a gay man, and he said that when so many of his friends and fellows were dying of AIDS, that they used ecstasy in the dance parties to work through their grief, and that it was very, very successful to have some kind of celebratory experiences, communal experiences. So this is to say that there are healing opportunities in many, many different contexts. So this is Alex's interpretation. This is just a pretty picture of an MDMA crystal that I wanted to include, because this is what we're going to be talking about. And so that we're doing work in the United States, but we also realize that we need to globalize. It's very important that the healing potential of MDMA be distributed around the world. And also, for even FDA approval, it helps where there's research in other countries. So our phase 3 studies were specifically designed to have subjects in Israel, Canada, and the United States, so that we already have somewhat of a small global participation there. We anticipate that FDA will go first, and Health Canada and Ministry of Health in Israel will go second and third. Now, we've gone to the EMA, as you can see, almost 5 years ago, and negotiated the phase 3 design. And basically what was so good about this is that the EMA said that they would take our data for FDA, and then we would only need to do one additional phase 3 study throughout Europe to get approval in Europe. So we are now moving in the direction of training therapists. And in Europe, and once we actually, if we are to get FDA approval and EMA approval, almost all the other countries of the world have reciprocity agreements and will take the data. So what we would need to do is really just train therapists in other countries. We won't actually need to do phase 3 studies in all these different countries. And there's estimated, 350 million people or so with PTSD. Now, I think that's actually a low estimate. And when you think about the number of people that are traumatized, that are not in a position even to get a diagnosis, or just think it's the standard way, there's just growing up. And the worst part of this, I would say, is that it's probably growing over the next decade or two. So we really have a mental health crisis, and we need to find out a lot of what we're doing. These are the places in Europe where we are now trying to do what are called phase 2 open label studies, where the training of our therapists has 3 parts. The first part is roughly 100 hours, some of it online and some of it in person, talking about our treatment manual, talking about our adherence criteria, how we evaluate whether people are adhering to the method, and watching videotapes of therapy sessions. The second part of the training is optional. It will never be required, but it's where therapists should have the opportunity to take MDMA themselves in a therapeutic setting. And then the third part is where people get supervised through the videotapes of their first PTSD patient, and then we give them feedback. And then once that has happened, and once we're clear that they understand the method that was used in phase 3, they're not constrained to using that. They understand what has been done, but they can blend it with other things, other therapeutic approaches if they want to do it. So we're in this process now of just training this new cohort of European therapists to do phase 3. Now, there's one potentially, maybe there's more, but I don't know, but there's one potentially good thing from Brexit, from our psychedelic point of view, which is that the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in England, is wanting to demonstrate that there is something good from Brexit. And so they were willing to approve the vaccine early on. And so there's the possibility that here in England, that we might get approval for MDMA-assisted therapy before even the FDA, certainly before EMA. So we're trying to figure out how we might do that, what kind of research we would need in England, but we are doing some studies now at King's College. So this is the possibility that this country might potentially be the first in the world. And so what you need to do to demonstrate to the regulatory agencies is you need to have 2 successful, what are called phase 3 studies. And these are the large-scale, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And we got approval in November 29, 2016 to go into phase 3. And we realized that there's a lot of methodological challenges, particularly with the double blind. So for many of you who've taken a psychedelic, and I assume it's many of you, you could probably tell the difference between a psychedelic drug and an inactive placebo. Not always. Sometimes people are really confused, or they're so ready to do work that they do incredible work, even with the placebo. But we went through this process, what's called special protocol assessment. So we took an 8-month slowdown, in a sense, before we began phase 3, and it was to negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design with FDA, including the statistical analysis, the methodologies, all the other information they want to see. And the goal of that is to get what's called an agreement letter. And we managed to get that. And what that means is that the FDA is legally bound to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD if our designs generate statistically significant evidence of efficacy, we have no new safety problems come up, and we've gathered the data in a way that they think is reliable. We've just had a big inspection from FDA and Health Canada. It was quite thorough, and we went through it okay. And so we do think that we are in very good shape to move forward with the application to FDA. So you have to do an initial study and what's called a pivotal study, and then a confirmatory study. Our initial study, and you'll see from the results, was so good that we met the criteria for going forward to the NDA, the new drug application, with just 1 phase 3 study. And so we applied to the FDA to do that, and they rejected our request. And what they said is that we needed more, they wanted to see more safety data. Not so much neurotoxicity, anything like that, but more psychological safety in PTSD patients. So we now have completed our confirmatory study as well. Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure where to point this. Yeah, it is the green button, but if somebody else can press it, I don't know. I can talk without slides if it doesn't work. But, oh, okay, great. All right. So we published the results in Nature Medicine, May 2021. And what was so exciting, this is the, sorry for the little cutoff thing, but this is our protocol. And this is what we're putting forward as our standard. And it's 3 MDMA sessions, each 3 to 5 weeks apart, basically a month apart. 8-hour sessions with a male-female co-therapy team. Not always, occasionally it's 2 women, very rarely it's 2 men, but it can be. And then it's interspersed with 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first session for therapeutic alliance for preparation, and then 3 of these 90 minutes for integration after each MDMA session. And then we wait a while, and the primary outcome measure is the 2-month follow-up. So it's 2 months after the last experimental session. So we wanted to make the point that there may be a psychedelic afterglow. There may be this period of time where, a couple weeks or so, people are feeling great. We wanted to talk really about, is this durable? And that's why we chose the 2-month time. Now, what's so important for insurance companies, because this is, you can see, it's very labor intensive. But what's really important for insurance companies is that it be durable. And so we did have a 1-year follow-up as well. And we've done other follow-ups that were on average 3.5 years, some for 7 years. We've got people that have been treated now well over 15 years ago. So we have pretty good evidence about durability. And so what we have set this up is that the first session is for those people that get the MDMA, it's 80 milligrams. And then 2 hours later, we give 40 milligrams, half the initial amount. And that's not to make it stronger, that's make it extend the plateau, because we feel that it's really important to have a longer time for people to work through issues. Sometimes stuff comes up, they're not ready for it, can come up again hours later. So we intentionally make this an 8-hour session. So a lot of these for-profit psychedelic companies are trying to figure out what they can do to make to contribute to therapeutic efficacy, to have a viable business. And so we've seen a lot of these stories that they can have shorter acting psychedelics, and that this might then fit more into your normal 1 hour or hour or 2 hour and a half, something regular therapeutic session. I think that's the wrong way to go, my sense. But all the exploration is good. But I think trying to squeeze psychedelic therapy into the traditional model isn't the way to go. And there was an incredible neuroscientist, Doblin at Johns Hopkins, and what she's done, I won't really talk about it much, but she's given MDMA to octopuses, to mice, to other things. And octopuses have become more pro-social under the influence of MDMA. But what she's shown is that the neuroplasticity, this kind of critical periods where your brain is able to really reorganize itself, that the critical period lasts after the psychedelic experience is over. And the longer the psychedelic experience, the longer period of time there is for this kind of integration work to take place in a way where your brain is really adaptable. And so ibogaine, for example, it has because it lasts a really long time, has one of the longest critical periods, extending weeks and weeks afterwards. So in general, I think this whole concept of trying to make the psychedelic experience shorter. On the other hand, we have 5-MeO DMT and other things which are short and do have incredible potential. So there's just a lot to be learned. So we start with the 80 and 40, and then it's an optional choice between therapist and the patient for the second session to go up to 120 followed by 60. And over 90% of the people do that, and over 90% of the people stick with that for the third session. So this is our treatment intervention. You could say it's 42 hours of therapy. So it is heavily focused on therapy, and it's 2 therapists. In the future, we would like, and I've heard the panel talk too about apprenticeship. So we'd like the lead person to be licensed to do therapy, but the second person ideally would be an apprentice learning, and then also charging less money for their time so that we would then reduce the cost. So the results, though, are in the context of this idea that because psychedelics have been suppressed, because there's so much stigma, we had to work with the hardest cases, and we had to work with sympathetic patients. So you've probably heard a fair amount about, or you may have heard a fair amount about, work with veterans. Now, 2/3 of the people in our studies are women with usually sexual trauma of different kinds. Less than 1/3 are veterans, but the veterans get most of the media, which is sort of consistent with American society where they're on a pedestal. So that was really important. We also needed a disease to study that was very expensive for insurance companies, that the results if people weren't treated were terrible and could involve suicide, and that the currently available medicines and psychotherapies helped some people, but left a large group still needing more treatment. So that's how we chose PTSD. And MDMA we chose strategically as the likeliest psychedelic to make it through the system first. It's more gentle, it's easier to reduce the fear. You don't have a lot of the resistance that people have to thoughts of LSD. And MDMA is ideal for PTSD. So that's how we came up with MDMA and PTSD. And now we are the only psychedelic company that has completed any phase 3 study, and we've completed 2. But you can see here that most of the people at the top are sexual assault or sexual trauma, and then various other things. And this is kind of a American pathology, but all these school shootings and stuff. So we've had people who had PTSD from that as well. So you can see there's a range of things, and roughly 2/3 are women. In our phase 3 study, the first one was severe PTSD. And so people had PTSD on the average of 14 years, but 1/3 had PTSD over 20 years. So you could see that this is chronic PTSD. And the way that's evaluated is that a lot of us can be traumatized, but we are resilient and we will recover. If people do not recover from PTSD after 6 months, it's considered chronic, and they're not likely to get better unless there's some sort of intervention. So we purposely then work with chronic PTSD so that we're not having to have our results confounded and stuff by sort of natural recovery or natural resilience. So again, this is people that have had PTSD a very long time. This, I think, is even more important to show that the positive ideation, which is sort of thoughts of suicide, self-harm, serious is where it moves into, affects your mood. It's positive behavior is even worse, where you actually do something. Now, it could be that you go to a bridge and you think about jumping off, but you don't do it. Or it could be in a failed suicide attempt. But you could see almost 1/3 of the people have actually had positive behavior to end their lives because of the trauma. And many PTSD studies don't work with people that have prior attempted suicide, but we felt we have to work with the hardest cases. This is a good example of the results. So the blue line is therapy with inactive placebo. And I don't know if we need to talk about it, but I'll just say that my dissertation was a lot on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics. And I did a big part on the double-blind methodology. And I thought that I had solved the problem. And I thought that the best solution would be therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. That would be the best way to get a double-blind. And the challenge would be to find the dose of MDMA that was large enough to start causing people to know something was happening, to get confused with maybe it was a full dose, but not so high that it was so therapeutic that we'd never find a difference between the two groups. So that was the theory. I'd solved the problem. And what it turned out is that in actual practice, we looked at inactive placebo, 25 milligrams, 30, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. And what we showed is that my idea was half right and half wrong, in that there is a way to get a dose of MDMA that you would confuse with a fuller dose. But what we showed is that the low doses of MDMA made people uncomfortable. It's like when you take off an airplane and there's turbulence at the beginning, and then you can get above a certain point, and then it's smooth sailing. But what we showed is that those people that got therapy without any MDMA at all did better than those people that got therapy with low-dose MDMA. They all still got better, but there was something that was confounding the therapy in these low doses. And you have people activated, but you don't have the fear reduction. So that's how we went to the FDA and the EMA, and we said, we will do whatever you want for the blinding design. But the real question is, if you can do this with therapy, why bother add a drug? And if you're going to choose blinding over this inactive placebo, you're going to make it easier for us to see a difference between the two groups. So that's why we ended up with this design of therapy with inactive placebo. But what you can see is that the groups start pretty much the same, but that there's substantial reductions in PTSD symptoms in the people that just get the therapy, in people that have been stuck for an average of 14 years and they've been through all sorts of other treatments. But so the therapy itself can be effective. And I'll tell you the statistics in a minute. But when you add MDMA, it's much better. And the other point, oops. Okay, I don't have a pointer, but if you look where the dots are, that's after the first MDMA session, after the second, and after the third. And what you can see is that the difference between these dots increases with each MDMA session. So what that means is that there's a cumulative effect, that you get more benefit from the second session, adding that, and then even more from the third, as compared to the therapy without. And the upper right-hand corner, the p-value, 0.0001. So what that means is that there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that these results are random. So it's absolutely astounding. And the FDA had that rule that if you get 0.001, which is 1 in 1,000, for your statistical significance, then you can ask for approval on the basis of just one phase 3 study. So the FDA said, we're fine with efficacy. You've persuaded us, but we want more safety data. So you can see this. And the 0.91 up there is the effect size. And that's very, very large. And that's what's called placebo subtracted effect size. So what that means is, and that's the normal way you do it, because normally a placebo is inactive, but in our case, it's not a placebo, it's therapy. And so what we've done to get that 0.91, an effect size of 1 means 1 standard deviation from the norm. So what we've done is, in that 0.91, we've taken therapy plus MDMA and subtracted out the therapy, and so we're left with the effect size of just the MDMA. But that's not what actually people are going to get in practice. They're going to get MDMA plus therapy. So that's the results. We did we worked at depression. Over 90% of the people who have PTSD also have depression. And functional impairment also improved a lot. So we have not done studies with people who have depression without PTSD. That may be a different kind of population, but what we do find is that when we work with people that have PTSD and depression, we focus on the PTSD, and the depression goes down as well dramatically. So these are now the results. The people that had the therapy with inactive placebo, 1/3 of them, 32%, no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD at the 2-month follow-up. So this is really great. This compares favorably with other therapies for PTSD, but this is in the hardest cases. These are people that have had chronic PTSD and had other therapies, other medications, and they had worked. So this is a way to demonstrate that our therapeutic approach is effective to a major degree, and also that the therapist, and this is something the researchers worry about, is, do the therapists try as hard when somebody gets a placebo? And the answer is they do. And so they have the same 8-hour sessions. And so this is a demonstration that 1/3 almost no longer has PTSD at the 2-month follow-up. But when you add MDMA, it's 67%. So now all of a sudden it's more than twice as good. It's 2/3. And then there's another measure which is called clinically significant reductions of PTSD. And that's where the symptoms are reduced so much so that there's a noticeable change in somebody's lives, but they still do have a diagnosis of PTSD. And so that was 21%. So that meant that we had 88% responders and only 12% non-responders. And what we're going to need to figure out, and what we do not know yet, is how to tell ahead of time who might be a responder and who might not be a responder. So that's going to be really important, again, for insurance companies, but it's really hard to figure out. I mean, there's kind of an intangible element of courage. Are people willing to look at what's difficult? Are they ready to do that? So one day we may be able to figure out, hopefully maybe with some of your help, who's going to respond, who's not going to respond. It might be similar to who responds to psilocybin or to ketamine or to 5-MeO, but we don't know that yet. And so the long-term follow-up, we just put out a press release a couple of weeks ago saying that the results are durable. And so this is really encouraging us to think that we will be able to persuade insurance companies to cover this. And in the phase 2 results, which are below, I just wanted to point out that it was 23% in the placebo group. Now, that was people that got inactive placebo, but also low dose MDMA combined. So you can see that's 23%. So that sort of confirms this approach that we understood, which is that the low doses do compromise the therapy to some extent. At the 2-month follow-up, it was 54%, and at the 12-month follow-up, it was 67%. So the important point there is that people learn how to keep healing themselves without the drug. So this is fundamentally different than a pharma drug. I mean, you all know this, where you have to take it on a daily basis and it controls your symptoms, and sometimes you stop the drugs and symptoms come back. So this is not like that. This is this idea that we are trying to help train people to heal themselves. And through the integration work that's done, they learn how to do that without the MDMA. And so the fact that people kept getting better over time, we can't say it's only to the MDMA therapy, because they're able to do other things, and those would also contribute, but they're motivated to do other things. So this is really good news for us and for the insurance companies. Now, yes. I guess you don't have if somebody could bring a mic, or if you can, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. When you subtracted out just the effect of therapy and then the effect of therapy with MDMA, at your later time point, are you actually going to look to see whether the effect of those who just had the therapy is as durable as those who've had both?
No, wait, can you say that again?
Yeah, so at the later time point,
yeah,
are you going to subtract out the effect of therapy, just people who've had therapy, and placebo, because it might not be as durable as those who've had therapy plus MDMA?
Yeah, okay. So we do what's called within subjects effect size. So that means that we look at the people that get therapy plus MDMA, because that's the way it's going to be delivered, and that's 2.1. So that's 2 standard deviations from the norm. Whether it's more durable for people that got the therapy plus MDMA versus the people that just got the therapy, I think so, but we don't have the data right now. Because in the phase 2 studies, what we did was, after each person had their primary outcome measure, we uncovered the blind on an individual basis. And then they did a crossover where they could do it again and get the whole therapy and get MDMA. So we don't have the long-term data on the. Now, in this current study with phase 3, the FDA said, oh, the double blind isn't going to work. And then there's 2 main areas to reduce experimenter bias. One, they said, is random assignment, so that everybody is similarly motivated. And then the other is independent raters. But what they made us do, and I think this is an ethical mistake, and we argued with them, is they made us wait to uncover the blind until the entire study was over. And so we may now have this ability, we should have this ability to answer that question. Is it more durable if you've got the MDMA plus therapy? But I haven't seen that data yet, but we will be able to know that. And why I think that was so ethically compromised is that we had one, I'll get to it in the safety data in just a second, but I'll say now, we did have one woman try to kill herself twice during the study and almost succeeded both times. She was in the placebo group. She recognized she was in the placebo group, but she knew she would have to wait several years before the entire study was over to do the crossover, and she didn't feel she could wait that long. Now, over 90% of the people guessed correctly anyway, so it's just an illusion that the FDA is sort of making us break the blind at the end. So, but I think it's an important question about the durability. And my guess would be, but and we'll report on this once we figure it out, is that when you get to the root of the problem with MDMA, which you do deeper than you do with therapy, that it's likely to be more durable. All right, so this was just the results suggesting, again, that it is durable. We're getting ready to publish the results, so that's why there's not more specifics now until we publish it. Now, there's a fellow named Vandercook who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and he's one of the world's experts in PTSD. His book, by the way, is amazing because he wrote it about 8 years ago And a couple weeks ago, it was the #1 best-selling paperback in America, and it's been continually that way over the last couple of years. So there's just an enormous uh, interest in trauma in the American book buying public. Now, Bessel came to us in phase 3. We didn't work with him on phase 2, and he said the people with the dissociative subtype, those are the hardest people to treat. So one of the common approaches when people are traumatized is to dissociate. You're not really there. But then when you try to come back into your body or back into your emotions, it feels even more overwhelming. And this is often due to people with had childhood trauma, complex PTSD, difficult attachment styles. And Bessel said, take those people out of the study. Don't work, you're going to compromise your results. Don't work with them. And we said, no, we need to work with the hardest cases. And also our phase 2 data suggested that it did work with people that were in the dissociative subtype. So what this shows in our first phase 3 study, that the hardest people to treat, those on the dissociative subtype, actually did better on average than everybody else. And that really astounded Bessel. And so that's made him, very much an advocate for MDMA. But one of the reasons I think that actually happened is people are so hungry for trying to be integrated in their selves, so in need of this ability to process trauma that feels overwhelming, that once they're able to do that, which the MDMA helps them to do that, then they can make even more rapid progress. So this shows, again, that it works in the hardest cases. So this is just effect sizes, as I described before, are designed to compare the results across studies. So these are not direct comparisons of MDMA with Paxil or Zoloft, but it's just to show that the drugs that have been approved by FDA for PTSD, Zoloft and Paxil, had the other part, just to say, you may not know this, is you have to have 2 successful phase 3 studies, but you can have an endless number of failed phase 3 studies. You just have to have 2 that succeed. And in the past, pharma would hide all the ones that they failed. Now, laws have been passed, and you have to post on clinicaltrials.gov studies that you're doing, so people can be aware if there's loads of failed studies. So Paxil actually had a failed phase 3 study, and small and on the low side of medium, and Zoloft had 2 very small effect size studies, and these were approved. And so MAPS and our MDMA-assisted therapy is light years above other therapies in terms of this effect size measure. Now, another big part of what you need to know is, how do we scale this? Is this really possible to scale? And so the concern is that maybe it's like therapists who are have been using psychedelics since college or before, and are super experienced, and only we get good results from super highly trained therapists and psychiatrists. And so we purposely took our most skilled therapists who did the most work in phase 2. Mike Lenny, we took them out of phase 3. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to please ask, thank you for everything that you do and everything that you're putting out there. I've got complex PTSD and BPD or EUPD, and I just was curious in how they were better responsive how they responded better to the treatment, please. As I've done different therapies with LSD, DMT, but I found when I did MDMA that to go back and revisit each trauma was like a lot. I was just curious as to how they did better, please.
Okay, so I think I'll summarize it and tell me. But you have complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder, and you're sort of wondering, when you do the therapy, do you have to go to every single trauma? Or so there's a problem in a sense in how we measure. The outcome measure that we use is accepted by FDA, accepted by EMA. It's all over the world. It's called the Clinician Administered PTSD Scale. And you have to have what's called an index trauma. And so everything is related to one particular trauma. But during the therapy, we permit people to go wherever they want to go. But when they're evaluated, the questions are asked by the independent raters: this particular trauma, how do you react to that now? But what we do see, and we call it the archaeology of PTSD, that when people take MDMA, they go layer upon layer upon layer through the different traumas. And we have this fundamental view of our therapeutic approach that there's this inner wisdom to the psyche. We all know our body heals itself below the level of our conscious awareness. We think that there's this barrier between conscious and unconscious mind that psychedelics, dreams, meditation, these things open up. And so we support whatever's emerging. So there's no way to say for me, like, yes, you're going to have to visit every trauma. It's whatever is coming up inside you, and it can come up in a memory, emotion, a body sensation, a pain. And we encourage the expression of the symptoms rather than the suppression of the symptoms. So, but I do think that in these 8-hour sessions, one of the advantages of them is that we're not just focused on this one supposedly major trauma. And there's problems with complex PTSD, particularly racial trauma, other things like that, where people have this whole series of traumas, but they can't identify one particular thing as the worst of all of them that they have to address. So my guess is that if you were to be we also have found that borderline personality just sort of seems to need a few more sessions as well. So complex PTSD. So not everybody is going to fit the 3-session model. Some people will do just 1 session. We think the standard might end up for many people being 2, but 3 or 4 will be possible as well. Yeah.
Oh,
Wait.
I talked to you in 2011, and we were talking because I'm bipolar and interested.
Okay, can you speak a little bit louder?
I talked to you in 2011. I'm bipolar and interested in mechanisms of psychosis, and you asked me whether I thought that MDMA would be suitable for bipolar because you had one person that was possibly going to be included. Did you ever include anybody with bipolar disorder, or have you avoided schizophrenia, bipolar because risk of psychosis?
Well, we do exclude people with bipolar,
Right.
but I will share that my younger brother is bipolar.
Right. So I've got an additional point. I would contend that this epiphany-based trauma resolution model that we're using with guided psychotherapy and some mystical non-dual states is only part of the answer. Because people are commonly going to have more than one thing often. They might have PTSD, they might also be schizophrenic, or they might be bipolar. Now, I'm managing my bipolarity, type 1 mixed mood states, and comorbid anxiety disorders without meds, apart from vaporized full-spectrum cannabis and psychedelics. I managed to train myself in the attention management mechanisms to be able to deal with that. Luckily, I would like us as a community to think about the protocols that you're developing along with this trauma-based resolution, to think about training us, because for those of us who have got organic disorders that are going to result in severe endogenous altered states of consciousness, you need to teach us how to fly. You don't stick someone in a helicopter and just go, there you go, mate, get on with it.
Yes.
Now, we need to think about those training protocols. I was an extremely lucky person that came from a dyadic partnership with a good ontological base with a severe disorder. That's easy to manage. You lot are unpicking the more nitty-gritty complex ones, but we really need to think about how you train people to withstand. I've been 15 days awake, bouncing like a loon, sectioned at the end of it. I've had more problems with the SSRIs than I've ever had with any amount of psychedelics.
Yes. Yeah.
So we need to think about those training protocols. There's a huge community here of people, psychiatrists, etc. We need to think about how to do that safely.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And so just as a point of research, you start with a defined population, and then over time, you relax the different exclusionary criteria and you bring more and more people there. What's very exciting is that there's a Dr. Steve Martyr, who's a world expert in schizophrenia. He's at UCLA, and he has now applied to the FDA to do a study with MDMA with people who are schizophrenic. But this would be done on an inpatient basis. It would be done with all the medications that they're taking. The MDMA would be on top of it. So there's a lot of unknowns how that will work out. But that's just one example of moving towards other previously excluded conditions. And then I think what you're suggesting is that there's a lot of other techniques that they need to think about that don't involve drugs either. Or shamanic apprenticeships, yeah. I think that the goal is really to expand to see how many different people can be helped. But I'll share that my brother, who's bipolar, informally we did MDMA, and it made him more manic. He had yes. Okay. Well, Yes. Well, let's talk afterwards because we are interested in sort of expanding it, but not right away. So first off, we have to get permission. The other thing that I'll say, so just about this. So we had 15 sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, 11 throughout the United States. And so we do an analysis to try to see, is the results coming from one particular site? This is what the FDA wants to avoid, that you have most of your patients from the highly skilled people, and then the other sites may or may not be similar. So we took our most experienced therapists, Michael and Annie Midover, out of phase 3. They focused on training new therapists, and we had no site-to-site effect. So what that means is that the newly trained therapists, through our program where they did administer, all of them did, not all of them, but almost all of them volunteered for MDMA, that they were supervised beforehand in phase 2. They went through our training program, that the results are consistent across sites. So this is really important for the idea of scaling, because now what we're talking about is trying to train 25,000 therapists in this decade. And so we do believe that this demonstrates that it will be scalable. Now, this is a 2 different studies combined together. So the Veterans Administration just did a study and published it recently with 900 veterans, and they compared prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And what they showed, those are the sort of yellow and green lines in the middle. So you can see that their study, which took about 6 years to do, started with people that were slightly lower in PTSD symptoms than we did. Ours is the red and the blue. But that they made progress, and the prolonged exposure was a little bit better than CPT. You can see that our results are the best at the bottom. But what's most important is the upper right-hand corner, and that has to do with the dropout rates. So what we had was 6.5% of people dropped out of MDMA, almost nobody. And in prolonged exposure and cognitive processing, around half the people dropped out. So their results are the results of the people that managed to stay in the therapy, and they're still not as good as our results. So there's something about MDMA that helps people to process the trauma, not be overwhelmed by it, and they can stay in therapy. So that's another advantage of this. And this has had an influence on the VA. We are now in about 7 or 8 different Veterans Administration sites around the United States. And we're exploring various different projects. And the big breakthrough that we hope will come maybe in the next year or so would be to move inside the Department of Defense and to work with active duty soldiers. And the theory here is that you want to work closer to the trauma. And so we are also, I know we're running out of time, so I'll just say that the FDA has said to us that if indeed we do get approval in adults, and our studies are 18 years or older, there's no upper age limit. It's more about health, heart health in particular, and other aspects. But that if we do succeed in adults, we are required to do work in adolescents with PTSD. So there are side effects. You can see that there's muscle tightness, decreased appetite, nausea. They're all more in the MDMA group than the placebo group, but these are non-serious, transient, treatment emergent, and they go away after the MDMA. So this is not a problem. I mentioned on the left, we did have one person try to kill herself twice. We also had one woman severe suicidal ideation, checked herself into a hospital, not to kill herself, also in the placebo group. So heart problems, we screen everybody, so we really didn't have heart problems. A little bit more in the placebo group. This abuse potential, bunches of our people have said, almost word for word, the patients, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. And so the thought, the FDA is worried, they're going to get MDMA in therapy, and then they're going to go out and buy it on the dance floor or something like that. They'll get addicted to ecstasy. And so it's painful. It's not fun. They don't associate it with fun. So what?
So I've just had my hand up for a while. Can I ask you a question?
Wait, sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you? Oh,
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Now we get.
It wasn't working a second ago. So I've been wanting to ask a question, and you just came in with this ecstasy thing. I'm a recovering addict, and there's a lot of curiosity in the addiction recovery community about treating addiction and the associated trauma with MDMA and the therapy. So I just want to know if you had an opinion or if there was anything happening around that.
Well, there's Ben Sessa, who's here, and did a great study here in England with alcohol use disorder and MDMA therapy. And what it turned out is that it turned into a PTSD study. Most of the people were running from trauma that they hadn't been able to process. So I think once you are able to work through the traumas, then people don't feel the need. So
I suppose the question is that when you're an addict and you're working with a drug that's trying to help you to deal with the drugs that you're coming off of, there is a kind of inherent danger that it could trigger or re-trigger the addiction that you're already recovering from.
We don't see that. And I think I think that the drug that is the psychedelic drug that's the most addictive is ketamine. And so I think we really need to be watching for that. I think you're right in the ketamine model. But I think working with psilocybin, with MDMA, with LSD, so far we haven't seen that. And you may know that Bill W., the guy that started Alcoholics Anonymous, he first went sober when he was given scopolamine henbane. And it was kind of a difficult psychedelic trip. We don't really use that because it's got a lot of toxicities and stuff. But in the 50s, Bill W. did LSD, and he thought LSD could play a major role in the treatment of addiction. And we have a lot of research that was done in the 60s with LSD for alcoholism. There's other work now that's recently being done with psilocybin with nicotine addiction by Matt Johnson and others, a reanalysis that was done of all the work with LSD. So I think it's a concern what you're suggesting. You have to watch out for it, but it doesn't seem to be happening that people who are in the therapy who have had prior problems with substance abuse, when they work through a lot of the traumas, they don't seem to be returning back to, dependency on MDMA or on anything else either. So I think the best example of that with MDMA has been Ben Sessa's work so far. And that's just a small study. We need to scale it up. But it's an important thing to be cautious about.
Thank you. Thanks.
In America, they call it California sober. I don't know if you've heard that term. It's for people that don't do any drugs except for psychedelics. And these are people that have been problems with addiction. So California sober is for people who've had addiction problems, but now they're focusing on psychedelics. The Science at the end of the year publishes a list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the world. And in 2021, they said that our phase 3 study in Nature Medicine was one of them. So it was particularly satisfying because 20 years before, Science had published this terrible paper that said that MDMA could cause Parkinson's. And as it turned out, this was a primate study. They killed a bunch of primates. We questioned it. The researchers funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse spent a year trying to replicate their results. They couldn't do it. And then they finally realized that they had mistakenly given methamphetamine instead of MDMA to these primates. And the National Institute on Drug Abuse never wanted to figure out how did that happen. But anyway, 20 years later, Science said MDMA was one of the top 10 breakthroughs. So our second phase 3 study is now being submitted to a journal, but the results were confirmatory. Very statistically significant, excellent safety record. And so we are now sitting in a phenomenal position with 2 successful phase 3 studies. Yeah.
With regards to trauma being mainly systemic, so caused by patriarchy or capitalism, is it sensible to be taking psychedelics into a patriarchal capitalistic model?
Yes, the answer is yes. That doesn't mean that we should accept the patriarchal model, but that we are in a situation, we need to work within the situation, and then we need to broaden it. So I think that one of the key aspects of what I've been trying to say is that we are helping people to heal themselves. I think that's one of the biggest, the power dynamics is really important. It's not that the therapist is the healer or even that the MDMA, but we are saying we are helping people to heal themselves and we are empowering them that way. So I guess I would ask a question is how else do we bring it forth other than in the current situation? And what are the things that we want to do to try to make it more equitable or more effective? And so those are the kind of things we need to work at. But 1 minute to go. I think the other big part of this, again, and I started out by talking about this, is that we have two track. One is drug development, the other is drug legalization. So we want this to be free for people to do without any kind of medical or religious context. And so I think that kind of democratizes it in a way as well. But I'd be also curious, and maybe we can talk about it at the party later tonight. But what are these ways that this patriarchal model is ineffective or oppressive, and how do we undo that?
Is that not what they said about opiates?
What
Is that not what was said about opiates? Also
said about opiates that
we needed to do it because this is the model that we have.
Well, I think, again, this idea of profit over people, so MAPS is the nonprofit, but we have the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and that's a modification of capitalism where what you maximize is public benefit, not profit. So I think the opiates got turned into this profit-generating machine that had profits as the top, and as a result, we had terrible problems with opiates. So I think that there's this inherent problem with capitalism that the public benefit corporation structure is an attempt to rectify, but it's only a partial attempt. And so, how do we change the big system? I think that we will be able to change the big system more effectively if more people are having therapeutic, spiritual, productive experiences with psychedelics. So I think, what this slide, and I know it just a minute, just to say that there's 2 points for us that we're really thinking about from a business point of view, is that the next point is FDA approval. And we think that'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of June 2024. But then beyond that is what's called sustainability. And so it's going to take us around a year and a half after MDMA becomes a medicine to have enough prescriptions, enough insurance coverage to start covering all of our costs. So really what we got to get to is first FDA approval, then Health Canada, then Israeli Ministry of Health, and hopefully potentially MHRA or maybe even before. But then this other goal is sustainability. And what we're proposing, and I think this is maybe to get to the opiate question as well. And what we're proposing is that only trained therapists be able to deliver this to patients, and that it only be delivered in an direct supervision, that it never be telemedicine, that the prep sessions, the integration sessions, they can be telemedicine, some of them, but that the actual dosing sessions should be under direct supervision of trained therapists. And so it's different than the opiates in that anybody could prescribe it. So we're going to have a special training for prescribers and special requirements for the therapists. And I think that will limit the kind of pill mills that happen with opiates. And so this is just some of the ways that we think that we're going to be negotiating with FDA. This is just say we want to. We spent $250,000 on lawyers, and we sued the FDA, and they wanted the lead person to be MD, PhD. They trained that, and they wanted a doctor on site, and they didn't want to give us permission for a protocol to give MDMA to therapists. So we won on on all of those things. We won that, and so we have to do this adolescent study. I just have 2 or 3. Okay. So we do have to do this adolescent study. The study that was done in octopuses where they became pro-social makes me think that it's pre-verbal. There's a physiological and a therapeutic component. So MDMA's pro-social effects are evolutionary conserved. Octopuses do process serotonin, and they become more pro-social. So I think for kids who may not be able to verbalize what's going on with them as well as adults can, they still will have these pro-social effects. So I think there's a real good chance that this will work. We have recently been contacted by people who want to fund a study for dogs that have PTSD to give MDMA to dogs. I have given MDMA to my dogs, and not because they had PTSD, but they just didn't do the integration work. But it was temporarily pretty effective. Now, this is another big study that we're going to want to do, sooner the better, is that we do ask people to taper off. We require them to taper off their SSRIs. However, a lot of people don't want to taper off their SSRIs. And one of the advantages of ketamine is you can give it to people on SSRIs. We're starting to understand more with psilocybin that it might also be able to be given with people on SSRIs. And there are informal anecdotal reports of therapists that give twice the dose of MDMA to people on SSRIs, and you have kind of a full MDMA experience. The concern is, do you generate serotonin syndrome, overheating, which could be very serious? But we haven't seen that. So what we need to do is a dose response safety study with people on SSRIs, because if you can help people on SSRIs into therapy and help them reduce their traumas, then it'll be easier for them to taper off the SSRIs. And we do want to train 25,000 therapists in this decade, and we hope to treat about 1.5 million people. This isn't counting group therapy. We're just starting to study group therapy. But we think there's going to be thousands. This is just, we made up these numbers, obviously. But it's just to show there's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics, and that the clinics are going to be like this. They're not going to be a ketamine clinic, an MDMA clinic, a psilocybin clinic. The therapists are going to be cross-trained in all the different modalities, and you go to these clinics and they will customize a treatment program for you. They may start with MDMA, they may start with ketamine, whoever. It's going to be up to the therapist and the patients, but this is the idea, that it's psychedelic clinics covered by insurance. And we're also seeing a lot of drug policy reform in the United States, and in particular in Colorado. They just passed in November to legalize natural plant medicines. People have what I think is a ridiculous, romantic notion that if it's from a plant, it's good. And if it's from a lab, it's bad. And so when you do the polling for these initiatives and you find out, if you say natural plant medicines, let's legalize access to natural plant medicines, you get more than 50%. You add in LSD or MDMA, or even just MDMA, and then, a synthetic drug, then the results go way down and it doesn't pass. So that's why these initial initiatives that are happening in cities and states are focused on natural plants. The Oregon was just psilocybin. Colorado is natural plant medicines. And so we're hoping over time that people will then say, okay, there's really not that much of a difference between a synthetic and a natural in terms of what they do. Now, this is just another example. When you think about America, and I'm not sure how often you think about America, but the states that are the most Republican, the most extreme, are Texas and Florida right now. A bunch of southern states are right up there too. But we have a bill right now, we'll know in the next couple of weeks, going through the Texas legislature to allocate money for a MDMA study with veterans at Houston VA. So we might get $2.1 million from the state of Texas. Also, in a way, just because of the support for the veterans. We have former Governor Rick Perry, who was, I think, about 15 years governor. He was in Trump's cabinet, and he's now one of our major advocates for MDMA because he knows a lot of veterans that have gotten help. So there is this paradoxical situation that in some of the most right-wing parts of the country, there is still supports for psychedelics. So we have managed to get bipartisan support for psychedelics. And I think that's one of the few things in America that is not wrapped up in the culture wars. And we just hope that it'll stay that way. So our long-term goal now, and this is just one more minute, is that for most of our time, for 37 years, is let's make MDMA into a medicine. That's our goal. Now it looks like that might happen. So the new goal is this idea of net zero trauma by 2070. Yeah. And to explain that net zero doesn't mean no trauma. There's always going to be trauma, but there's an estimate that by 2050, there could be 1 billion climate refugees. And we know that since the pandemic, the amounts of depression, anxiety, suicide have been increasing. So we'd like to get to the point where, and I'll say there's also multi-generational trauma, we know, passed down through epigenetics and other ways. So we would like to envision a world where we are no longer adding a burden of trauma each year to more people. A couple of years ago, the VA said that there was 12 million PTSD patients in America. Recently, they said now there's 13 million PTSD patients in America. So the world of net zero trauma, healing for all, it means really going around the world. Most of us, we focus on FDA, on US, Europe, but we really want to go to where the trauma is, not to where the money is. And that's what this goal, but I do think it'll take multiple generations to do. But this is our new goal. We're going to develop a gross national trauma measure. So Bhutan has gross national happiness. There are measures of democracy, measures of peace. So we want to work and develop this gross national trauma, and that will be the metric by which we evaluate whether we're making any progress. And we want to work with prisoners. We want to work with victims, treating trauma, reduce recidivism. You see so many people who want to work on refugees and migrants and really go to where the trauma is. And this is going to require new group models, because a lot of these countries don't have psychiatrists and psychotherapists, or they have them in such small numbers. So we're going to have to work with indigenous healers. This maybe gets back to the patriarchal model. We're going to have to find other models, and this will probably also involve treating families together the way some of the indigenous do as well, because a lot of refugee camps, you have families together, but they're all traumatized. So these are just people we're working with around the world to do different things in these kind of other countries. And then just to say that we want to look at psychedelics for conflict resolution. We've got a contract with Hebrew University. It's the largest academic group for conflict resolution. And Lior Rosman, who's at Imperial College, has done great work with Israelis and Palestinians, taking them to Spain to do ayahuasca together. And we're trying to figure out the metrics to evaluate this. And also MDMA is phenomenal for couples therapy. And we'll say that the FDA has recently informed us, people at the FDA, that people think that you can only get approval for diseases, treating what's in the DSM, depression, anxiety, adjustment disorder, whatever. But that's not the case. We've been told that we could get approval for couples therapy. And then that might help that if we get approval to get covered by insurance. So what we have to do is negotiate what is the primary outcome measure. Because for couples therapy, if you say, oh, do they stay together or not, that's not the right measure. Some couples should probably separate. So we need some other kind of a way to evaluate if we're making progress in couples therapy. We agree on secondary measures, and then we can do this. So this is like couples, cultures in conflict, couples in conflict. And so I'd like to invite you all to Psychedelic Science. It's the world's largest psychedelic conference ever. It's coming up in June. We've already got over 5,500 people coming. And so we'd like to invite any of you that want to come as well. So thank you very much. And